In this section, let us study about microsporogenesis. By definition, microsporogenesis is nothing but production of pollen grain from pollen mother cell. So it is a process of producing pollen grains, and we have to study how we get pollen grains from pollen mother cell. Now, as we have studied the structure of anther, in the anther we have studied the structure of an anther, and there are 4 chambers, and we studied the structure of these 4 chambers, the layers that are present. There are 4 layers, and inner to those 4 layers we find these sporogenous tissues, and they give rise to microspore mother cell, or we also had called it as PMC. Today we have to study how from this PMC we are going to get these pollen grains. Now these sporogenous tissues, which are compactly arranged, which are homogeneous, they are able to later on give rise to each cell of the sporogenous tissue will give rise to pollen mother cell. Pollen mother cell, or it can also be called as microspore mother cell. Both are same. So from each cell of the sporogenous tissue we get pollen mother cell. So this is, let's take this as a pollen mother cell, and each pollen mother cell is diploid. It has got 2 sets of chromosomes, and therefore it is diploid. From this diploid pollen mother cell we will get pollen grains. What happens? This diploid pollen mother cell will undergo meiosis, division, it undergoes meiosis to produce microspore tetrad. Microspore tetrad. That means actually it is producing 4 microspores, but since they are attached to each other, they are not divided. So we get 4 microspores which are attached together, and therefore it is called as microspore tetrad. These microspore tetrad later on separate, and they give rise to 4 separate pollen grains, and these are called as the male gamete. Therefore we get pollen mother cell from sporogenous cells. This pollen mother cell will undergo meiosis to give rise to microspore tetrad, and this microspore tetrad later on separate and give rise to pollen grains. Thus we have pollen grains, and this entire process is called as a microsporogenesis. Let us now study about pollen grain. Pollen grains are small structures which cannot be easily seen by naked eyes. That means we can see some dust-like particles, but if we have to study the structure of pollen grain, then you have to take it and under the microscope you have to see, to look at the structure. Now if we take the microspore, that means the pollen grain, it is a very small structure. That means it is around, most probably it is a round in structure, and its diameter is between 25 to 50 micrometer. Okay, it's like this. So it is between 25 to 50 micrometer in diameter. This pollen grain is made up of 2 important layers. The first layer is called as exine, because it is outside, and the next layer is called as the intine, because it is the inner layer. So these are the 2 important structures that we find in pollen grain. Now let us look at what is this exine. Exine is the outermost layer, and it is made up of one chemical which gives maximum resistance to any harsh condition faced by the pollen grain, and that chemical name is called as sporopollenin. So very important, sporopollenin. it is a chemical that is present on the exine, and therefore the pollen grain is very rough and it is very difficult to break the pollen grain. It cannot be broken very easily, because after leaving the flower, this pollen grain has to face lot of hardship, that means environmental hardships, and therefore to preserve the male gamete that is present inside the pollen grain, it has to protect itself, and therefore nature has its protection by means of sporopollenin. So it is a chemical which protects the pollen grain from the outside. Now this sporopollenin is present everywhere on the exine except one part, that is the germ pore. I will tell you what is the function of this germ pore. Except in this place, the sporopollenin is present in the entire area of exine. Now when you look at this exine under the microscope, you can see varied structures that we can see in the exine. It can be spiny shape, star shape, or zigzag. That means this exine itself has got different species of pollen grain, will have different structure of exine. So that makes it special, and it is also easy to identify the pollen grain to which plant it belongs to. So that is one more point for you to remember. So exine has got sporopollenin, which makes it tough to break, and it is absent only, the sporopollenin is absent only in germ pore. The second layer is the intine. Intine is present inside the exine layer, and it is usually made up of cellulose and pectin. So these are also hard materials, but not hard as sporopollenin. Now this intine will protect the inner contents of the pollen grains. That means whatever is present inside the pollen grain. Soon we will see what does it contain. We have seen the outer structure of pollen grain. Now let us look at the inner structure of pollen grain. Now when we look at inside, after the plasma membrane, in the cytoplasm, this pollen grain contains two cells. One larger cell and another smaller cell with the nucleus. Now the larger cell is called as the vegetative cell. Vegetative is larger and it contains food reserves, that means food material. And the smaller cell is called as the generative cell. That is smaller cell in size. So we have vegetative cell and then generative cell. So these two cells have got particular function to perform in the future. Now generative cell is the male gamete. Actual male gamete is generative cell, and vegetative cell will have the function of producing pollen tube to transfer generative cell to the destination. Now at this stage, most of the pollen grains are released from the anther. That means this stage is called as the two-celled stage. Why it is called two-celled? Because the pollen grain at this stage contains two cells, vegetative and generative cells, and therefore 60% of the plants produce and then disperse pollen grain at this stage. That means where the pollen grain has got vegetative and generative. There are another 40% of plants which shed pollen grain at a three-celled stage. What does it mean? Three-celled stage means this pollen grain will have one vegetative cell and two generative cells. So therefore, at that moment, that particular pollen will be called as three-celled. It is not very common. Most of the time, the pollen grains are shed at this stage, that is two-celled stage, which contains one bigger, larger vegetative cell and one smaller generative cell. So this is a common fact. Whereas three-celled stage are little rare to find. That means 40% we have said, and most of the time whatever we see around us are belonging to this type, that is the flowers which produce two-celled the flowers which produce pollen grains and which disperse the pollen grain at a two-celled stage. Now we know the importance of pollen grain. They are very much needed for the sexual reproduction. But there are also side effects of pollen grain, not to the plants but to human beings. Now some species of pollen grain always cause pollen allergy. What is this pollen allergy? That means when we human beings are exposed to these pollen grains, we start getting irritation of the skin, or we may also develop like asthma, bronchitis, etc. And therefore that is called as a pollen allergy. One best example is a Parthenium. It's also called as carrot grass and commonly known as Congress gida. And it grows in any environment and is also ubiquitous and it is found everywhere. So everywhere the Congress plant or the Parthenium grass is found. And the pollen grains of this grass causes allergy. So whenever you either touch the grass, the pollen grains, your skin starts itching, and also some also get this breathing problem. This Parthenium grass came along with the wheat when India was importing wheat from the other countries. This grass, the seeds of this grass came along with this, and they have invaded entire place around us, and therefore wherever you go you find this Parthenium grass, and therefore they are causes of pollen allergy. This is one effect of pollen grain, but there are good effects of pollen grain also. Some species of pollen grain are used as food, supplements of food in the form of tablets and syrups, because they give good effect on our health, and therefore they are used, especially in foreign countries, in western countries. There are pollen tablets and syrups are prepared, and they are consumed as food, as supplements of food. And therefore especially the athletes, it is said that intake of this pollen syrup or tablet increases their performance. That means they are able to perform well. Not only these athletes, and also the race horses. That means their stamina increases when they take in the pollen grain in the form of syrup or tablets. And therefore there are side effects, that means bad effects, and also there are good uses of pollen grain. For plants, of course, it is a means of sexual reproduction. But for human beings, along with that, these syrups also can be used as food supplements. And thus we have gone through all the steps and we have studied what is the stamen, which contains anther and filament, and the filament is attached to thalamus or to petal, so it differs. And also the number of stamens and the length of the stamens also differs from species to species. Secondly, we have studied about the structure of anther. It is bilobed, and each lobe has got two thecas, and in each theca further we find microsporangia, which further develops into giving rise to pollen grain. And we also saw the structure, the different tissues that are made up of, that is the outer layer of anther is made up of the epidermis, followed by endodermis, middle layers, and tapetum, the most important part, which nourishes the pollen mother cell. And inner to the tapetum we have the specialized compact cells. When anther is young, though the cells are called as sporogenous tissues, which later on will give rise to pollen mother cell. Pollen mother cell, after developing, that means undergoing meiosis, they give rise to pollen grains. And pollen grain has got different parts. The outer exine wall is there, and then inner intine wall is there. The exine wall is covered by sporopollenin, and the intine is made up of cellulose and pectin. And the content of pollen grain, we know it contains one large vegetative cell and one smaller generative cell. And most of the time pollen grains are shed at a two cell stage, that is pollen grain containing one large vegetative cell and one generative cell. Another 40% of the plants also shed pollen grains at a three celled stage, that means one vegetative cell and two generative cell. So there is 60% and 40% of plants exhibiting this character. And also we know that pollen grain, for human beings, some pollen grains cause allergy and causes asthma and bronchitis. And there are some other pollen grains also used as food supplements, as syrups and tablets, which help in the performance of athletes and also race horses. So thus we have completed the first part, the chapter, that male organ, male sexual organ, that is nothing but the stamen.